Hi, I am Sister Judy, and I am appointed to tell you the story of the Last Supper painting. Let's talk about the most iconic, mysterious, and most controversial painting in the world, the Last Supper.
We are in Santa Maria del Grazie, church in Milan, Italy, looking at Leonardo da Vinci's Last Supper. The Last Supper painting is a snapshot of the moment when Christ tells his apostles that one of them will betray him. Very truly I tell you, one of you is going to betray me. The painting depicts each apostles reacting in their own unique way. There is another aspect of the narrative which is important. You can see Christ is reaching towards both wine and bread, and this is the institution of the sacrament. The sacrament of the Eucharist, we might know, is Holy Communion, when Christ says, "Take this bread, for this is my body. Take this wine, for this is my blood, and remember me." And you can see that Christ reaches out towards the bread and the wine. But what's interesting is at the same moment, Judas is reaching towards that same bowl. Judas is the one who's going to betray Christ. He's been paid 30 pieces of silver by the Romans, and you can see that he grasps that bag of silver in his right hand as he pulls away from Christ. His face cast in shadow, but he's pulling away at the same time that he's still reaching out to the bowl. And that's one of the ways that Christ identifies who will betray him. It is the person who shares, who dips with him in that bowl. It's interesting because the history of this painting is really about scholars arguing what moment really this painting is about. But through this painting, the apostles could just really be understood as reacting to Christ's words, "One of you will betray me." It's Christ saying, "Take this bread, for this is my body, and take this wine, for this is my blood." In the Last Supper painting, Leonardo tells us several moments in the story, while also giving us a sense of divine eternal importance, which means we would never mistake this for 13 people having dinner. We know that this is the Last Supper, or we know that this is an important moment, but without any of the obvious divine symbols that we would have in the earlier Renaissance, such as the halo. The figures themselves are monumental in this space, creating a kind of energy, a kind of chaos that surrounds the perfection, the solemnity, the geometry of Christ. Christ forms an equilateral triangle. His head is in the center of a circle. The window that frames his head reads as a halo. There's that calm center, and then human beings with all of their faults and fears and worries around that divine center. This is Leonardo da Vinci, who is thinking about mathematics. He's thinking about science. He's thinking about the integration of all these things. If we look at earlier image of the Last Supper, there's lots of room at the table. There's lots of decoration in the room. What Leonardo does is he simplifies everything and focuses on those figures and their gestures. And by making it so that there's no room behind the table, the figures take up so much space. It's separating our world from the world of Christ and the apostles. There's no way for us to enter that space. In fact, there's no way for them to move into our space. There really is this demarcation. In versions of Last Supper that Leonardo would have seen in Florence, Judas is sitting on the opposite side of the table, and by putting Judas with the other apostles, he does use the table as a barrier between our world and the word of the apostles. Let's look at those faces for just a moment. Christ is so serene, and his eyes are down. One hand is up and one hand is down. To his right is a group of three, and there's Judas who's facing away from us in shadow. His neck is turned, reminding us that the night he will hang himself. Now, as he pulls away, Saint Peter, Christ's protector, rushes in. He's got a knife that he holds around his back, and he comes in, seeming to say almost, "Who is it I need to defend you?" The third figure in that group with Judas and Peter would be Saint John, who looks very resigned and closes his eyes, and that's the tradition in paintings of the Last Supper. My favorite three figures are the figures on the far right. Leonardo was very interested using the body to reveal the soul, to reveal one's internal nature. But Leonardo was creating these four groups of three, that idea of knitting the figures together, overlapping them with one another, creating all this drama and creating tensions and contrasts between emotional responses of all these figures. There's that incredible grouping of Thomas pointing upward as if to say, "Is this something that is ordained by God? Is this God's plan that one of us should betray you?" But of course, that finger also foreshadows him actually proving Christ's resurrection by plunging that finger into Christ's wound. We have Philip and James, the major, and they're in opposition, one throwing his arms out, one bringing his hands together. And if we were to compare this with the earlier Last Suppers, we would see the way that the figures remained very separate from one another. And there's the idea of the unified composition, which is the characteristics of the High Renaissance. But what I sense here more than anything is the divinity of Christ here in the center. His calm, the way that was all those perspective lines to bring us towards him. It's interesting because that perspective that the artist is rendering is slightly at odds with the perspective as we see it from down here on the floor. That is, we would need to be close to Christ's level to see this painting in a perspectively correct manner. And it's interesting in a sense. It elevates us as we look at this painting. We would have to be 10 to 15 feet off the floor to have the perspective work exactly perfectly. So we have this divine presence in the center, indicated in all of these different ways. Now, keep in mind, we're not seeing this the way that people would have seen it in 1948. The painting is in terrible condition because Leonardo experimented with a combination of oil paint and tempera in an environment where fresco would have traditionally used, and the painting began to deteriorate soon after it was completed. Unlike a traditional fresco, which is painted on wet plaster, Leonardo painted on dry plaster, and the paint never really adhered to the wall. So luckily for us, the Last Supper has been conserved. And so, in some ways, this is a perfect representation of the higher Renaissance. It is finding a way of creating a sense of the eternal, a sense of the perfect, but within the chaos that is human experience, uniting the earthly and the divine.
I hope you have learned a lot from me. May the Holy Spirit be with you always.